Pokemon Legends ZA has its newest trailer, and even if things still change quite a bit throughout the end of development, I know who the villain is. It's not this guy. It's not this lady. It's this cabbie. In the most recent trailer, you get to see a brief clip where they explain how the battle zone rank up works. If you go all the way from rank Z to rank A, you get a wish granted. This taxi driver makes an appearance both in the trailer and this key screenshot that Pokemon has shared on social media. This guy wants to abolish all forms of transit other than taxis. Now, I don't have anything against taxis. I think they provide a necessary service, especially in car-dependent cities. Whether you like that or not, that's just reality. However, to abolish all forms of transit except for taxis? You monster! Now, this is not the first time that the taxi drivers in Lumio City have had a bad look. It's not just their generally creepy vibe. In the original X and Y, if you took a taxi somewhere in the city and didn't have enough money to pay for it, the taxi driver would take you, a child, into the back alley and battle you. Now, despite this being a hilarious mechanic for a video game, the implications of what the taxi driver is doing in this situation are, well, they're villainous. Let's look at how public transit compares to private vehicles in 5 metrics in the United States, which is where I live. Crime, injury rate, equity, money, and time. Let's get into it, starting with everybody's favorite topic, crime. Mainstream media often portrays public transit as unsafe, highlighting a theoretical risk of theft, assault, or some other crime. A really, really large train accident is much more likely to get news coverage than, like literally every car crash. But the reality is, crime rates in public transit are insanely low compared to when you're just driving your own car. I looked at a lot of different studies, and it's a little bit variable because the studies looked at different metrics, and crime itself is a pretty broad category. But you're somewhere between 20 and 60 times more likely to experience crime in a private vehicle than on any kind of public transit. The reality is, most people just pay their fare, go sit down on the bus, scroll on their phone, pull out their Nintendo Switch family of systems, and wait for their stop. Next up, we have injury and fatality rate. According to the US Department of Transportation, in the year 2022, which is the most recent complete data I had access to, there were 2.4 million injuries from car accidents and around 44,000 fatalities. Let's compare that to public transit. In the same year, 2022, public transit experienced 340 fatalities and only around 19,000 injuries. Now, on a surface level, this data seems extreme. However, statistical analysis is not simply attained by just looking at gross data. In the United States, 9 out of 10 people who commute to work are using a private vehicle. Let's take a quick look at this map that looks at the prevalence of whether you're driving, walking, or taking public transit when you're commuting. Everyone is driving, or at least taking a private vehicle in some way. Well, except for like these 6 people who live in these 5 counties in Alaska. For a more fair comparison, we're gonna look at injury rate per 100,000 people who drive or use the bus. Essentially what this does is it tries to remove the bias from the pretty significant use differences between taking a private vehicle and taking public transit. So first up, for cars, there are around 316 people injured and 14 fatalities per 100,000 drivers. That's about 1 in 316 people. Wait, it's 316 out of 100,000 and 1 out of 316? That just sounds like I made up some numbers that sound good. 316 times 316. Math is cool. Now let's take a look at public transit. There's about 55 people injured and 5.8 fatalities per 100,000 users. This one's fairly obvious. When controlling for population size, you're much safer riding a bus, riding a train, than you are driving your own private vehicle. There is one other study I wanted to mention that comes from Montreal. The injury data I mentioned doesn't always control for what happens when you take cars off the road. So more people using public transit means theoretically less people using a private vehicle. And what this study found is that if you're walking or biking along a commuter route where there's a bus, you're 4 times less likely to have an injury than if you're going along a route that is mostly used by private vehicles. So far, crime and injury go to public transit. Next up is equity. Equity in a lot of ways should be the most important one. Everybody should have access to the community that they live in. Transportation equity means that everyone in a community should have access to food, shelter, healthcare, any kind of land use that promotes health and well-being and access to resource and opportunities. Examples: grocery stores, hospitals, doctors' clinics, education, place of employment, pharmacy, gyms and recreation, housing. All pretty important things to access. The average cost to own and use a car on a daily basis is pretty high, and if you're of lower socioeconomic status or you're living close to the poverty line, driving is not feasible for some people. Having equitable access to public transit allows people who can't really afford a car or don't have access to a car the ability to use their community and access community resources. Also, not everyone can even physically drive a car, right? So only 65% of people with disabilities in the United States can even operate a vehicle, and around 10% of the adult population doesn't even have a driver's license. That's 25 million people who don't drive. Public transit is just more equitable in this way because it allows everyone to have access to their community regardless of their situation. Next up is cost. Now, I know people who don't get bus passes because it costs too much and they'd rather commute every single day. Let's take a look. According to the American Public Transport Association, the average household spends 18 cents of every dollar spent on private vehicle cost. That's almost 20% of every dollar you spend on your car. The average cost of operation per vehicle is around $1,000 per month. Let's compare that to the cost of utilizing public transportation. According to the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, the average cost per ride for any form of public transit is $1.50. Now let's take an extreme example. Let's say you need to take 4 rides per day to go where you work. So it's $1.50, $1.50, $1.50, $1.50, $6 per day. Go even a step further and say that for some reason you're working 31 days in a month. You need to pay $6 every day for 31 days for a total of $186 spent just on public transit. That's just car insurance for most people. Not only that, but even in the more expensive places to live, most of the public transportation is much more affordable than even this $186 number. Here are some examples. Another thing to consider is taxpayer cost. Traffic accidents costs the American taxpayers about $30 million per year, about 10% of all of the cost of traffic accidents. That's $230 per household. That's almost enough to buy a new Nintendo Switch I guess maybe it's not that much, but you get my point. It costs much less to use public transit. Finally, time. I saved this one for last. The average commute time in the United States is 27 minutes. The average commute time is 1.9 times longer if you take public transit compared to a private vehicle in ideal driving conditions. Now, this number is skewed slightly due to the infrastructural constraints and barriers placed on actual door-to-door time travel for public transit, as well as in the United States, city planning being heavily designed around car dependency. Like we said earlier, 9 out of 10 people, up to 92% of commutes take place by car. Now, this might feel like an argument that cars are always faster. Not necessarily. Basically, it depends. Let me explain. Driving is faster when the sparse resources for public transportation inhibit its growth and potential. If you look at places that have invested more time and effort into their public transit, the commute time can be lower. And we've already talked about the huge benefit of having just less cars on the road in general. Basically, though, time is a lot more complicated. It depends on city size, city distance, the density, what the infrastructure resources are like, the tax system. It's not binary. I'm not a city planner. I'm not an engineer. I'm a gamer. But since all the other metrics we're looking at the US, time for sure goes to driving at this point. I want to briefly mention the concept of convenience and driving. I didn't include convenience because it's a little bit more nebulous and much harder to measure than the other metrics we talked about. Many people feel that it's more convenient to drive due to the perceived freedom they have while driving a car. Personally, I'd rather sit on a bus seat and play my favorite Pokemon game on the Game Boy Advance SP, Pokemon Emerald. But also, in a vacuum, if you're out in beautiful nature and driving on empty roads, I agree, driving can be kind of nice. However, in the context of Lumio City, we're not talking about that. We're talking about this. Commuter hell. So to summarize, most of the data we talked about would suggest that public transit is just a better option, other than the more complicated variable of door-to-door time. Let's go a step further for a second, though. Let's pretend every person spends the same amount they currently spend on private vehicles on public transit. Larger cities would have more wealth in their transit departments than some smaller nations. That's how expensive it is. It's insane. You could imagine then, with increased funding, Not even to the level I just mentioned. It's feasible that no matter where you live, you could hop on a bus or a train within 5 minutes and end up wherever you wanted to go. Now, I know what some of you may be thinking. These proposals aren't necessarily realistic for everyone. The weakness of many of the studies I mentioned is they look at larger city populations. They don't examine rural areas. If you live in a town of only 2,000 people, especially if the town is really spread out, something like this might not be feasible. What I believe is, when we have data like this, we should use it to bring people together. So that way people living in small rural communities and people living in big cities have the best access to inexpensive, efficient transit, whether that's a bus, a car, a train, whatever. That's what transit should be, whether it's private or public transit. And that's exactly what makes this statement by the cab driver truly villainous. It's the absolutism of the argument. No cars, no buses, no trains, just taxis. Corporate greed at the cost of human welfare. All the sources I used for the video are in the description if you want to check things out and form your own conclusions. Almost all the data was taken from the US Department of Transportation, the US Bureau of Transportation Statistics. If I used data that seemed like it was from a few years ago, it's because that was the newest complete data that I had access to. But whether you're strongly for taking your own car to work or taking public transit, I think we can both agree that this guy sucks for suggesting we live in a world without either option. Wait, wasn't this supposed to be a Pokemon video? Now, this number is skewed Now, this number is skewed slightly. Why do you freaking put those two words